Hello Year 10. A couple of you have emailed me with some questions on the poems and they're seeming that they're not your favourite thing, which confuses me because I thought that you wouldn't love anything more than these poems from the Power and Conflict unit.
Poop mouth. Poop out of your mouth.
So I thought I'd make a couple of videos for you on each of the poems, and I thought I'll also continue to make some on the language exams. So hopefully there'll be one or two of these coming out each week, just to make sure you've got the basics nailed when it comes to these poems. So the first one I'm going to start with is The Charge of the Right Brigade, mainly because I absolutely love Tennyson. The Lady of Shalott is probably one of my favourite poems. So I thought I would start with him. Now, let's begin with a little bit of AO3 context. So Tennyson, from his really early days, like from when he was an infant, he was already a great poet. So it was no surprise that when he went to university at Cambridge, that during his time there, he had his first set of poems published, and then shortly after became poet laureate. And actually still today, he's our longest serving poet laureate that we've ever had in this country, which means that he was tasked with writing poems based on events and things that were happening in this country at the time. So therefore, in 1853, when the Crimean War broke out between us and Russia, he obviously was going to write about it, and particularly the Battle of Balaclava, in which for the first time the British people heard something negative about our military in terms of the fact that actually they were being given a really poor command. Some of our military, 600 men, were told to ride uphill into Russian fire, and it was basically a suicide mission for them. Now, they did come out victorious, but obviously this was quite a controversial thing at that time. So Tennyson composed it. He composed it actually standing up, walking around in his home, and sent it off to the publishers in a rush. But the sense of movement through the poem is really obvious, and I would say it's one of the most famous poems with this continual sense of movement. And that's because it has dactylic lines in it, which means that there is a stressed beat and then two unstressed beats. So a dun 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 dun, all the way through, half a league, half a league. And you can hear it consistently and continually throughout the entire poem. And that replicates those horses, the cavalry, charging on and charging on for that half a league. Now, half a league is only about 1.5 miles, so it's not huge amounts of distance, and yet we are with the soldiers because of that pace and that meter throughout the poem. We're with the soldiers kind of consistently every stride that is taken. So stanza 1, I'm not going to go through every stanza for you, I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm just going to make sure that you have got the bare basics. So we start in stanza 1 straight away with this sense of rhythm built by the dactylic lines, that first stress beat and those two unstressed beats. Plus we've got a triplet, half a league, half a league, half a league onwards. The triplet embeds that sense of rhythm, okay? Then we hear about the soldiers going into the Valley of Death. Now, death is personified here. That's really important for us because it suggests that actually these fighters aren't fighting the Cossacks, they're actually fighting for their lives. It stresses that actually this is a little bit of a suicide mission for them. You can make links there, obviously, with kamikaze. But obviously, Valley of Death connotes a famous verse in the Bible, which is, when I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And that's from Psalm 23 in the Bible. Now, at the time, the theory of evolution was bubbling around by Darwin. However, it was still largely a Christian country, a God-fearing country at home. And these would have been God-fearing men. And what that line means, what that psalm means, Psalm 23, as I walk through the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. It suggests that actually these men were still courageous, despite having to obey such a ridiculous and horrific command by their general. They still actually did it because they were God-fearing men who had God in their hearts. And so that they rode onwards and they feared no evil. So that little valley of death, the connotations around that are really significant for this poem. Then we get the command. the command from their commander telling them to go forward. And it's really significant that after the command, in direct speech, so we hear it for ourselves, it says, he said. So it's very dismissive of the person who's in charge, just using that pronoun, he. It's quite dismissive of him. It doesn't suggest anything about his title or his position or his status. So there's a little bit of maybe a negative slur on that person. And obviously in that command, we hear that they are the Light Brigade. Now, they could have been called the Light Brigade just because there was another brigade at the time called the Heavy Brigade. So it's in contrast to them. However, we know that that word light carries so much connotations of hope, do you know what I mean, of victory with it as well, that they are light, they're travelling into somewhere which is light, particularly in contrast to death, which obviously we link to darkness. So therefore they are bringing hope, they're bringing light into this place which is so hellish. Let's move on to stanza 2. Stanza 2 begins with that repetition of the command. Again, I think the repetition of the command is important because it shows that the soldiers are just merely following the command, that we have to hear it to say they were told to do this. Then, like in bayonet charge, we get a rhetorical question which lends us to be able to understand the thoughts of the soldiers. And so we get to hear about what they're thinking. Then we hear about theirs. You know, we get the repetition of theirs, theirs, theirs. So again, now the focus is on the soldiers, and the focus is about giving these soldiers this kind of status of heroes, how it shows how honourable they are. You know, it uses the words do and die, and the typical phrase is actually do or die. But actually for them, it's do and die. Like, their option here is to go forward into death for themselves. We've got the triplet on theirs, theirs and theirs. Again, it builds up that rhythm and obviously shifts the focus onto them. And I think we have a real increase of pace in stanza 2 with the reply, why, die rhyme that we have. That quick rhyme increases the pace. It increases of the galloping of the horses, and we hear that with them. And I think it's at this point that Tennyson starts to really submerge the reader within the poem, and that definitely continues into stanza 3, because stanza 3 starts with the cannons to the right of them, cannons to the left of them, and the cannons in front of them. The cannons are all around, and we as the reader are now put in that position where we can see for ourselves the cannons that are surrounding us all. On top of that, we get the volleyed and we get the thundered, which obviously are onomatopoeic sounds. So not only can we see the cannons all around us, but we can hear them as well. Then we get that really harsh D sound, which we've talked about so much in class. It's typically used in Gothic fiction, you know. I walked down the dark, doomy path, and it's to set up that sense of doom. That D sound always creates that sense of doom for us as a reader. And so we get a lot of imagery of what we can see and what we can hear in that third stanza. And obviously amongst all of the volleys and the thundering and the cannons, we hear that word boldly to describe the soldiers, which again fixes us on how heroic they are. How, you know, the fact that they came back triumphant as well, even though they had lost about 120 to 150 men, it stresses how bold they were, how much they did carry hope. How great that these soldiers were, despite the poor command they were given by their general. Hell at the end of stanza 3 as well, really interestingly for us. Again, the Cossacks and the Russians aren't described, but hell is. And we've got the jaws of hell. And it's described using a semantic field to do with a beast. And so hell is kind of created as this horrible beastly image that they have to actually fight. It's almost that they have to go into the jaws and defeat hell itself to be triumphant. So I'm going to stop there. There's loads more that you can now go off and explore. Now I've done the first 3 stanzas for you. Maybe you want to look at the anastrophe, which begins the next stanza 4 with flashed, and what that definition is and what it is and why it's anastrophe. Maybe you want to look at the line all the world wondered and why the pace slows on that line. But hopefully you've got the beginnings of something there and actually the basics of Charge of the Light Brigade. Great. So hope you stay safe, Year 10. Missing you as always, and our fantastic lessons that we always used to have and I'm sure that you dream of daily. So goodbye.